Amid more shelling around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the UN Security Council meets on the crisis and calls for urgent access to the site.
The grim job of recovering and identifying the victims of the war in Ukraine. We have a special report.
The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged both Russia and Ukraine to cease all military operations around the main nuclear plant. Now, the nuclear complex was reportedly struck by artillery shells 5 times on Thursday, including near the site where radioactive materials are stored. The head of the UN nuclear watchdog, Rafael Grossi, said the agency must be allowed to inspect the plant, which is the largest in Europe. He warned fighting near the site has sparked a grave crisis. Russian forces currently occupy the plant, and it has been the subject of a number of artillery strikes throughout the war. So just how serious is the situation at this nuclear power plant? Well, I've been speaking to Elizabeth Shackelford, a former official at the US Department of State and now senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I asked her if there's anything that international institutions like the UN and the IAEA can do.
Question as to how effective it's going to be is, of course, in the hands of people we don't control, like President Putin of Russia. But we need to continue to try and put multilateral pressure on Russia to allow inspectors in. We need to ensure that the UN puts those inspectors there as well. Russia's been claiming that the United Nations and the IAEA has been the block to bring them in due to security concerns. But I think that the diplomacy needs to continue because, quite frankly, there is not a palatable military solution to this current standoff. So we all need to, every country needs to do what it can to put pressure on Russia to pull back and allow some independent observers in and to demilitarize this area.
Elizabeth, how big is the risk right now, in your view, of some sort of accident happening at that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant or something even worse?
Well, it's very hard to put it exactly into a measured terms there because it's hard to know exactly what's going on. But the longer that this continues and the longer that there is shelling happening in that vicinity, the higher the risks are that could be an accident. I think that the risks of anyone intentionally blowing up the plant is exceedingly low because the costs are so high to all sides and everyone. But the risks of an accident, of some form of radiation leakage or hydrogen leakage is getting higher by the The sad truth is, though, that risk doesn't need to be very high for it to be exceedingly serious.
So where do we go from here, Elizabeth? How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think that we need to use all the diplomatic tools that we have at our disposal. That means, engaging through the United Nations, but also the United States has an opportunity to do kind of diplomacy 1 degree removed. We're not going to be able to do anything at this stage to persuade Putin or Russia directly. We just don't have that kind of leverage. And we've already kind of thrown a lot on the table in terms of the leverage that we have with sanctions and our military support to Ukraine. So at this stage, we need to look at who we have leverage over, who has some leverage or influence over Putin. I think there have been some indications that, China, for example, does not feel particularly comfortable with this situation either. And that's the kind of nation that could have influence on Putin. It needs to be a full court press by all nations who do not want to see a nuclear disaster.
As you've described, Elizabeth, we've had so many competing narratives up until this point. Is it possible to say who has the upper hand in the conflict right now?
I think that's very hard to say at this stage, and I'd hate to predict anything, but we do anticipate that this is going to continue to be long and drawn out. I think that morale is going to play a very big part. Seeing the vulnerabilities of Crimea, for example, with what's been happening this week, certainly isn't going to help Russian morale any, and it might really help boost Ukrainian morale. But it's going to be a question of who has the support, the materials that they need to continue for the longest period of time, unfortunately. So I think we're dug in for a long conflict.
Well, a special report for you now, and it's impossible to accurately know how many people have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine. The challenges in identifying and repatriating soldiers killed on either side means that, according to the Ukrainian government, only around 400 fallen fighters have been returned home. And as Weir Davis reports now from eastern Ukraine, when occupied villages are taken back, it's a painfully slow and difficult process to recover the dead. I want to warn you, his report does contain some distressing images.
At the very start of this war, Russian soldiers were filmed entering the suburbs of Kharkiv. Some of the fiercest fighting took place in and around this eastern city. While the Russian troops were eventually repelled, Kharkiv came under relentless shelling and rocket attack. Some occupied villages between Kharkiv and the nearby Russian border have been liberated.
There was an unexploded grad sticking out of the ground right in the middle of the road.
But the road to Momotove, littered with the detritus of war, is still too dangerous for most civilians to return. And before people come back, there's important work to be done. Momotove has to be made safe, and bodies, many of them buried at haste in shallow graves, have to be recovered.
Well, this village was deep inside Russian-occupied territory. It's still a live firing zone, as you can probably hear in the background. But what these guys do now, they're locals, they're digging up the bodies of Russian soldiers who've been killed in the fighting. After they've been bagged, they'll be taken away for DNA sampling, and eventually they'll be repatriated to Russia itself.
Piled on top of each other, the bodies of 6 Russian soldiers. Yuri the gravedigger takes this grim work in his stride, and even though these men, when alive, were fighting to defeat Ukraine, he feels for their families.
It's not difficult, but it's not pleasant work either. These men have people waiting for them at home, mothers, fathers, and children. I understand that, because I used to serve in the Soviet army myself.
It's Russian police, National Guard, Russian.
Little giveaways like unit badges help with identification. Some of these men fighting for Russia may have even come from pro-Moscow regions of Ukraine. It's messy and dangerous work, even as more bodies are uncovered, reminders that this is an active war zone. Ukraine says it's meticulously trying to identify those killed. A railway goods yard, their resting place for now. The repatriation of war dead does happen, but it's sporadic. We find plenty of Russians, says Lieutenant Colonel Oleksandr Kutsenko from the repatriation unit. Recently, we did a 160 for 160 body swap in the south, but most of those were found here in the Kharkiv region. The bodies we saw being dug up have now been repatriated. But with no end in sight to this war, the number of dead will inevitably go up, and more bereaved families on both sides will anxiously await the return of the fallen. Wura Davis, BBC News.
The UN's asking for a clear commitment from the Ukrainian government to end the institutionalisation of disabled children. It comes after a BBC News report from 5 facilities in the south of Ukraine that found teenagers tied to benches, adults living in cots, and severely malnourished children. Human rights officials say the wars made their situation even worse and called on Ukraine to right its historic wrongs. There are nearly 700 such institutions across the country, with parents encouraged to give disabled children up to the state.